The nervous system. The nervous system is for grade 11. For you to understand it, you need to listen, get your book, get a copybook, take notes, and stop and repeat at any point. The nervous system together with the endocrine system are responsible for your homeostasis. The homeostasis, as we said, is responsible for keeping the balance or the internal conditions of your body constant at all times. The nervous system is physically connected to every part of your body. It means it has wires that are connecting every part of your body. The endocrine system is different. The endocrine system is not physically connected. It's exactly as the satellite. It sends the information, and only the parts of your body that have the receptors that are going to get the information and follow the orders. So, the nervous system is formed of two types of system, the central and the peripheral. This is one of the most important parts of the nervous system, one of the most important components, which is the neurons or the nerve cells. The nerve cells are formed of, first of all, we have what we call the cell body. The cell body is the part of the neuron that contains the nucleus and organelles. And then we have the axon. The axon is a long extension that carries electric messages away from the cell body and passes them to other cells. And then we have these many branches, which are the dendrites, which are branch-like extensions of the cytoplasm and the cell membrane that receive the messages from the neighboring cells. Okay, so the axon sends the message. The dendrites, they receive the message. So if the dendrites, for example, receive the message that there is cold weather on the outside, they are going to pass this message along the cell body into the axon, which is going to be taking it to wherever is responsible for regulating your body temperature. There are three types of neurons: sensory, which are responsible for the senses; interneurons, which connect between the different neurons; and motor neurons, which are responsible for action. The nervous system also relies on specialized support cells. For example, there are cells which are called Schwann cells, here they are, that cover the axons. A collection of Schwann cells, which is called a myelin sheath, it's a cover of the axon and helps the axon to send the messages. So we have the cell body, the dendrites, and the axon. Okay, so what happens during the transmission? The transmission between the neurons. Before the transmission starts in the neuron, before any action starts in the neuron, it has to cross a tiny gap between the neuron, which is called the synapse. So these neurons, here, if we go back to this picture, these dendrites, they are not physically connected to the coming dendrites. There is a little bit of an empty space between dendrites. They are not sticking to each other. This space between the dendrites is called the synapse. The axon terminal, the part of the axon through which the impulse leaves the neuron, contains a chemical-filled vesicles. These vesicles, they contain chemicals. What do these chemicals do? They release it into the synapse. What do they release? They release what we call a neurotransmitter. A neurotransmitter is a type of chemical that conveys a message from one cell to another. Typically, many synapses connect neurons. Before the adjacent neuron starts the action, it usually needs to be stimulated at more than one synapse. The amount a neuron needs to be stimulated before it produces an action potential is called a threshold. Okay, so the neurons, they need to be stimulated. More than one synapse are collected at each point, and what type of stimulation and what is the amount of stimulation that each neuron needs in order to produce a certain response is called the threshold. How do we understand this? If you think, for example, about pain, not all of us feel the pain the same. We call this pain threshold. So if it's not easily for you to feel pain, this is what we call a low pain threshold. Okay? if it's, we call it a high pain threshold. But if it's very easy for you to feel pain, if someone touches you, you still feel pain, we call this a low pain threshold. So a high pain threshold means that you need a high amount of pain to feel the pain. A low pain threshold means that with the minimal amount of pain, you feel the pain. So the threshold is the measurement that each cell has in order to feel different things. The nervous system. Two very important parts form the nervous system. We have the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system is the central part of the system. It is the brain and the spinal cord. And then the peripheral nervous system are all of these wires that are connecting the central nervous system to the rest of the body. So, for the central nervous system, which is formed of the brain and the spinal cord, these organs, the brain and the spinal cord, they work together to integrate and coordinate sensory and motor information for the purposes of controlling the various tissues, organs, and organ systems in the body. The central nervous system is responsible for higher neural function, like what? Like, of course, the memory, like learning, like emotions. These are called higher neural functions because they are mainly present in higher organisms like humans. Your brain. The entire brain weighs about half as much as a textbook. Okay? So it weighs about 3 pounds in adults. Of course, it's formed of 75% water, 20% of oxygen, and contains 100 billion neurons. It controls body functions and interactions with the outside world. The brain is formed mainly of 4 parts: the cerebrum, the diencephalons, the brainstem, and the cerebellum. This is the cerebrum, and then we have the diencephalons, and then the brainstem and the cerebellum. This is the cerebellum. This is the brainstem that directly goes to the spinal cord. Okay, so these are the components of the brain. The cerebrum. Okay, we will start with the cerebrum. The cerebrum is the part of the brain that interprets signals from your body and forms responses such as hunger, emotions, motion, and pain. The cerebrum has right and left halves, or what we call hemisphere. Each hemisphere controls the opposite side of the body. So the right hemisphere of your brain processes all of the stimuli received by your left hand. Similarly, the left side of your brain controls the muscles that kick your right leg. When the spinal cord brings the signal from the body, the signal crosses over to the opposite hemisphere in the corpus callosum. The corpus callosum is a thick band of nerves that connects the 2 hemispheres. So we have the cerebrum, which is formed of 2 hemispheres. Each one controls the opposite side of the body, and they are connected by an important bridge, which is called the corpus callosum. Then, the outer side of the brain is called the cerebral cortex. The cerebral cortex means cover. Okay, so the cerebral cortex, which is the outer side of the cerebrum, it interprets information from your sensory organs and then generates responses. The cerebral cortex is about as thick as a pencil. It is thick. It's not a simple part of your brain. The cerebral cortex, its size is deceptive because it folds, give it a large surface area. It is way larger than you might think. If the cerebral cortex were unfolded, it would cover a typical classroom desk. The surface area is large enough to hold more than 10 billion neurons. The neurons in the cerebral cortex are arranged in groups that work together to perform specific tasks. For example, movement is initiated by an area in the brain called the motor cortex, and the sense of touch is received by the sensory cortex. Scientists divide the cerebral cortex into different areas or lobes based on the function. Each hemisphere of the human brain can be divided into 4 lobes: frontal, parietal, occipital, and temporal. Here they are. We have frontal, parietal, which is on the side. We have the occipital, and we have the temporal, which is closer to the end of the skull, closer to the ear. So we have frontal, parietal, temporal, and occipital lobes. Of course, all of these divisions are made by scientists in order to be able to study the brain properly. The frontal lobe is responsible for personality, reasoning, and judgment are controlled in the frontal lobe. It also coordinates voluntary movements and speech production. The parietal lobe, which is on the side, it contains the sensory cortex, which interprets and coordinates information regarding touch, where that is contained in this lobe. The temporal lobe is responsible for speech and hearing that are carried out by the temporal lobe, and it also plays a role in memory. The occipital lobe is responsible for vision. So, frontal, personality, reasoning, and judgment. Parietal, senses. Temporal, speech and hearing. Occipital is responsible for vision. Then we have the cerebellum. The cerebellum. The cerebellum is the part of the brain that coordinates your movement. It helps you maintain your posture and balance, and it automatically adjusts your body to help you move smoothly. For example, if you brush your teeth, your cerebellum gets information about where your arm is positioned compared with the rest of your body. Your cerebellum plans how much your arm would need to move in order to brush your teeth. So it's responsible for coordination. It is responsible for adjusting the amount of movement you're doing at all times and keeping your balance. Then we have the brain stem. The brain stem connects the brain to the spinal cord. See, here is the brain stem. We said that this part is the brain stem. It is considered like the end of the brain, and it goes directly to the spinal cord. So, the brain stem connects the brain to the spinal cord and controls the most basic activities required for life, which are the very most important activities, breathing and heartbeat. The brain stem has three major parts: midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata, which are shown here. Here, look here. This is the brain stem, and it forms of three parts that are then connected to the spinal cord. The brain stem is very, very important because it's responsible for breathing. Midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata. The midbrain controls some reflexes, such as changing the size of the pupil to control the amount of light entering the eye. The pons regulates breathing and passes signals between the brain and the spinal cord. The medulla connects the brain to the spinal cord. It controls basic life-sustaining functions such as heart, vomiting, swallowing, and coughing. So again, the brain stem is controlling a lot of involuntary actions in your body, like breathing, like heart rate, like vomiting, like swallowing, and coughing. The spinal cord. The spinal column consists of, column is different from the cord. Column is the whole thing. So the spinal column consists of vertebrae, fluid, meninges, and spinal cord. The spinal cord is a rope-like bundle of neurons that is about as wide as your thumb. It connects the brain to the nerves that are found throughout the body. All signals that go to or from the brain have to pass through the spinal cord. Although movement is controlled by your cerebrum and cerebellum, your brain depends on your spinal cord to deliver the messages to the proper muscles. When you're brushing your teeth, again with your teeth, you want to move your arm. The cerebrum sends an impulse down the spinal cord. The impulse is directed by an interneuron to the motor neuron that connects to the arm muscles. The motor neuron then carries the impulse to the receptors in the arm muscle. When the receptors are stimulated by the impulse, this is when your arm moves. You don't feel all of this communication. You only feel that you decided to brush your teeth. But all of these communications are happening because they make sure the movement is done properly. This is why any problems with the spinal cord, any fractures within the vertebral column, it causes major problems to the person, because it is responsible for coordination of movement and is responsible for taking all the messages from the brain and delivering them to the rest of your body. So if the spinal cord is damaged, messages cannot move between the brain and the rest of the body, and this results in paralysis. The spinal cord also controls some involuntary movement, which are called the reflexes. Here is the spinal cord. So, about the reflexes, the reflex arcs are nerve pathways that need to cross only two synapses before producing a response. Because the signal never has to travel up the spinal cord to the brain, you react quickly. What does this mean? For example, when the doctor, you must have seen it in many of the movies, when a doctor only simply taps your knee. What happens? This connects your kneecap to your leg. Okay, the sensory neuron are going to sense an impulse to your spinal cord, and interneuron in the spinal cord directs the impulse into the motor neuron, and it's going to cause your leg to jerk. The reflex arcs are really important because they shorten the relationship. Sometimes you need to take a reaction without much processing, and this is when the reflex arcs play a very important job. For example, if you touch something hot, this doesn't have to go through many processes in your body. If you touch something hot, the way you retract your hand away is done through reflex arcs, because otherwise your hand would be burned. That's it for today. We're going to continue tomorrow.